Kansas Prairie, October 1879. The smoke column rose 40 miles to the south, climbing higher than any thunderhead the settlers had ever seen. And the wind that pushed it carried the smell of burning bluestem grass straight toward the cluster of homesteads along Salt Creek. Every settler in the valley stood outside their cabin that morning watching that black wall advance, and every one of them was calculating the same desperate arithmetic. How fast could a prairie fire run when the wind was up? How long before it reached their fence lines? Whether the fire breaks they had plowed last spring would hold against flames that travelers said could leap 100 feet in a single gust. Leland Atterbury was on his roof with a wet blanket beating at embers that had not arrived yet but that he was certain would. DeWitt Atterbury was shouting at his wife and children to get down into the root cellar. Jessamine Kincaid was running between her cabin and her well hauling water in a bucket that sloshed half empty with every step. And in the middle of that valley, in a cabin that did not look like any other cabin in 3 counties, Maren Hewitt set a kettle on her iron stove and put water on for coffee. She did not run. She did not climb her roof. She called her 2 children inside, barred the door, and sat down to wait for the fire to come and go. What she had built would hold, or it would not. She had spent 18 months making sure it would. 18 months earlier, spring of 1878, the train from Topeka rattled west across the open grassland, and Maren Hewitt sat in the 3rd car with her 2 children beside her, watching the landscape unfold through a window smeared with coal dust and fingerprints. Her son Paul, 5 years old, sat on her lap with his face pressed to the glass. Her daughter Margaret, 8, sat across the aisle reading a primer she had borrowed from a church in Pennsylvania and never returned. Maren was 34 years old, broad in the shoulders from a childhood spent helping her father turn hay on the great Hungarian plain called the Puszta. And she carried herself with the steady deliberation of a woman who had already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime and had decided not to lose anything else if she could help it. Her husband had died of cholera in a Pennsylvania mill town 6 months before. He had converted their savings into American dollars before the disease took him, and that money, a small leather pouch of paper bills, rode in the pocket of Maren's traveling coat, along with 3 documents, a deed of sale for a quarter section of Kansas Prairie land, a letter of reference from the pastor of their church in Scranton, and a photograph of her grandfather standing in front of his tsarda on the Puszta, taken sometime in the 1850s when photography was still a novelty in the Hungarian countryside. Paul pulled his face away from the glass and looked up at her. "Will the new house have windows, Mama?" Maren looked out at the prairie rushing past. The grass was tall, nearly waist high in places, bending in long silver waves under the wind. The horizon was flat and unbroken in every direction, so flat that she could see the curve of the earth at the edges where the sky came down to meet the grass. And something in the pit of her stomach shifted because she recognized this landscape, not from Kansas, from home. This was the Puszta. The same grass, the same wind, the same enormous sky pressing down on flat ground that stretched further than the eye could follow. She remembered her grandfather's roadhouse east of Debrecen, the long blank south wall with no windows, not one. The bare ground scraped clean around the foundation in every direction. She had asked him once when she was 7 or 8, sitting on his knee after supper, "Grandfather, why is our house uglier than everyone else's?" And the old man had looked down at her with his weathered face and said very simply, "Because everyone else's house has not burned yet." She turned to Paul. "The new house will have one window," she said. "One very good window." The Salt Creek settlement was not her first choice. It was her last. The land was cheap because the previous claimant had walked off it after the Prairie Fire of 1874, burned his soddy, and killed 2 of his oxen. The railroad agent in Topeka had told her plainly that any homesteader who took that quarter section needed to understand what fire could do on the open plains. Maren had nodded at the agent and signed the papers without hesitation. Where she came from, the pusta burned every dry summer, sometimes set by lightning, sometimes set on purpose by herders who knew that fresh grass grew best where old grass had been cleared by flame. She knew what grassland fire could do. She also knew what it could not do if you built correctly. She arrived at Salt Creek in late April with her 2 children, 3 trunks, and a mind already working on a problem that none of her new neighbors had thought to ask about. She did not build her cabin that first summer. She dug a sod dugout cut into the south face of a low rise, and she lived in it with Margaret and Paul through the hot months, while she did something that no other settler in the valley had ever done. She studied the wind. She kept a notebook, the same kind of small leather-bound notebook her grandfather had carried in his vest pocket for 40 years. Every morning at dawn and every evening at sunset, she walked to the top of the rise above her dugout and stood in the grass and held a wetted finger up and recorded which way the wind was blowing and how strong it felt. She noted the temperature. She noted the moisture in the grass. She noted the color of the sky to the south and the west and the east. The land itself taught her things the notebook could not record. She learned that the blue stem grew tallest in the low ground along the creek where the roots drew water even in dry weeks, and that fire would burn hottest there because the fuel was heaviest. She learned that the ridges to the north stayed damp longer after rain, and that the soil on the south-facing slopes baked dry before everything else. She walked the boundaries of her quarter section in the early mornings when the dew was still on the grass and the wind had not yet risen, and she counted her steps and memorized the contours of the ground, the way her grandfather had memorized the contours of the pusta around his roadhouse. Because a woman who knows her land can read its dangers the way another woman reads a letter. Margaret helped her carry water from the creek in the evenings. The girl was strong for 8, and she did not complain though. The buckets were heavy and the path was steep. One evening, as they climbed the rise together, Margaret stopped and looked south at the endless grass stretching toward the horizon and said, "Mama, this looks like the picture of grandfather's land." Maren set her buckets down. She looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said, "that is why we are going to build the way grandfather built." Margaret picked up her buckets. "Good," she said, and they walked the rest of the way in silence, the kind of silence that exists between 2 people who understand each other and do not need to fill the air with words to prove it. The first Sunday after her arrival, she hitched her mule to the small wagon she had bought in Topeka and drove 3 miles down the creek to the Methodist meeting house where the valley's settlers gathered for weekly services. Reverend Grover Ashford, a tall, thin man, with a careful voice and careful eyes, introduced her to the congregation. "We have a new family among us, Mrs. Maren Hewitt and her 2 children from Pennsylvania, originally from Hungary." The silence lasted 1 beat too long. Jessamine Kincaid, the blacksmith's wife, leaned toward Tabitha Atterbury and whispered just loudly enough for Maren to hear from 2 rows behind. "Hungary. Where is that exactly?" Tabitha whispered back. "Somewhere near Turkey, I think." Maren smiled politely. She had heard worse in Pennsylvania. That night after Margaret and Paul had fallen asleep on the straw mattress in the dugout, Maren sat by the tallow candle and opened her notebook. "South wind all day," she wrote. "Stronger in the afternoon. Grass drying from the roots." Then, below the weather notes, she added a line that had nothing to do with the wind. "The women here are strong. Their hands are calloused like mine, but they do not ask me anything." She spoke to anyone who would speak to her about the fires that had come through the valley before. Most of the settlers were polite but brief. They had their own work and their own worries, and a Hungarian widow living in a hole in the ground was a curiosity but not a priority. The person who gave her the most useful information was an old freighter named Hiram Colfax, who had been hauling supplies along Salt Creek since the late 1860s, and who knew the feel of the prairie the way a sailor knows the feel of the sea. Colfax was a lean, quiet man in his 60s who had survived on the plains longer than anyone else in the valley, and he had no patience for pretense and no interest in gossip. When Maren found him at the creek crossing one afternoon and asked him about the fire of 1874, he studied her for a long moment, then climbed down from his wagon and drew her a map on the back of a flour sack with the stub of pencil. He marked the directions the worst fires had come from. He marked the ridges and draws and creek beds that channeled the wind. He marked the spots where previous homesteads had burned and the spots where they had survived. Then he hesitated before handing her the sack, and he said something that stayed with her longer than any of the wind data she had collected. "You're the first person to ask me about this in 20 years of hauling through this valley." Maren took the flour sack carefully. "Where I come from, you ask before you build." Colfax looked at her for a while. Then he said, "The man who had your claim before you, he was a good man, strong, worked hard. He just didn't ask anybody." She copied the map into her notebook that evening and studied it by candlelight until the pattern emerged clear and unmistakable, exactly as her grandfather had said it would be. 3 out of every 4 bad fires in the Salt Creek Valley came up from the south or southwest, driven by hot dry winds that built strength as they crossed Oklahoma and pushed north into Kansas. The 4th bad fire usually came from the west when a cold front pushed through and a backing wind drove flames eastward. Almost no fire of any size had ever come from the north. The north was where the rain came from. The north was where the cold came from. The north was the safe direction. By the time the first snow fell that winter, Maren had decided exactly how she would build her cabin. She would orient it to face north. She would put the only window on the north wall, sheltered from every fire wind the plains could produce. She would make the south wall, the west wall, and the east wall solid timber with no openings, except a small ventilation gap high under the eaves, screened with iron mesh. She would orient the long axis east to west, so that the narrowest face pointed south into the strongest fire winds. She would bank the walls with sod. She would clear a wide fire break around the structure. She would move every combustible thing, the woodpile, the chicken coop, the barn far away from the cabin. And then came the night she almost changed her mind. January 1879. A blizzard had been blowing for 2 days. Their dugout was damp and cold, and Paul had developed a cough that grew worse every night. Maren sat by the stove with her drawings spread on the packing paper she used for drafting, and she listened to her son cough in his sleep, and she looked at what she had designed: 3 blind walls, 1 small window, a shelter built for fire, not for living. Margaret, who could not sleep either, came and sat beside her. "Mama, will the new house be bright inside?" Maren looked at the drawings. 3 solid walls, 1 window. She thought, what if I add 1 small window on the east wall, just 1? For the morning light. Margaret would like the morning light. She picked up her pencil. She placed the tip on the east wall of her drawing, ready to mark the opening. Her aunt stopped. She was remembering a house on the Pusta, not her grandfather's house. The neighbor's house 2 miles east of the Charda. That family had put a small window on the east wall. For the morning light, the wife had said. In the summer of 1847, the year Maren's mother was born, a grass fire came from the northeast, an unusual direction, a direction nobody expected. That small east window cracked in the radiant heat, and the house burned. The family survived, but lost everything they owned. Her grandfather had walked her past the ruins when she was a girl. He had pointed at the foundation where the east wall had been. 1 window, he said. 1 was enough. Maren put the pencil down. She wrote in the corner of the drawing in small, careful letters, "Paul will understand when he is older." She folded the paper and went to check on her son. His cough would pass. The next fire would not pass so gently if she built wrong. In April of 1879, she hired Roscoe Gatewood, a German carpenter, from a neighboring township. Gatewood was a careful man who did what he was told and asked few questions. He had hands the size of dinner plates and a precision with a broad axe that came from decades of training in the old country. Where Maren showed him her drawings, he studied them for a very long time. He turned the paper, he held it up to the light, he set it down on his workbench and traced the lines with 1 thick finger. "This is built for fire," he said in his heavy accent. "Yes," Maren said. He nodded slowly. Then he asked 1 more question, the only personal question he would ask in 6 weeks of working beside her. "Your father taught you this?" "My grandfather." Gatewood nodded again. "My grandfather built wine cellars in Bavaria with walls this thick, but he was afraid of landslides, not fire." Then he picked up his measuring line and went outside to mark the foundation, and that was the longest conversation the 2 of them had during the entire construction. They worked through May and into June, hauling oak logs from a stand of timber along the creek, squaring them with broadaxe and adze, fitting them into walls that were thicker than any walls in the valley. The cabin was small, only 16 feet by 22, but the walls were nearly 10 inches thick of solid oak dovetailed at the corners. With the precision Whitewood had learned in Bavaria, Maren spent 3 weeks after the timber was up, cutting sod from the prairie and stacking it against the southwest and east walls to a height of nearly 6 feet. Then she borrowed a breaking plow and spent 4 days cutting a fire break 30 feet wide in concentric rings around the structure. She moved her woodpile 70 feet east. She built her chicken coop and her small barn for the milk cow on the lee side of the ridge 100 yards north. The work was brutal. Cutting sod by hand in the Kansas heat was labor that would have tested a strong man. Maren was a strong woman, but she was one woman, and by the end of each day her arms trembled and her back ached and her hands were raw from the spade handle. Margaret helped where she could, carrying water and stacking the lighter pieces of sod, and even Paul tried to help by dragging small clumps of cut grass away from the firebreak perimeter, though he was 5 and the clumps were nearly as big as he was. Leland Atterbury rode by one afternoon in late June and found Maren on her knees in the dirt, cutting sod with a hand spade because the plow blade had broken that morning. He watched her for a moment from the saddle. Then he dismounted and walked over and stood beside her and said, "Mrs. Hewitt, I have a spare plow blade in my barn. You are welcome to borrow it." Maren looked up at him. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat. "Thank you, Mr. Atterbury." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something? Are you banking the whole house in soddy? 3 walls, south, west and east. That is a great deal of work for one woman." "Yes." He waited for her to say more. She did not. He nodded slowly and went back to his horse and rode to his barn and came back an hour later with the plow blade and a jug of water. He left both at the edge of a firebreak and rode away without another word. It was the most generous thing anyone in the valley had done for her since she arrived, and it was also the last time Leland Atterbury visited her claim before the day in July when he stood in front of the church and told the congregation she was burying her own house. The neighbors had been watching since late May, and they had been talking since the first log went up without a window frame in it. But it was not until a Sunday in the middle of July, at the gathering after services at the meeting house, that the full weight of the community's judgment came down on Maren Hewitt in a single afternoon. Leland Atterbury spoke first. He was a tall farmer from Indiana who had claimed the section directly south of Maren's land, and he was not a cruel man. His voice carried genuine concern when he addressed the small crowd outside the church. "I rode up to see the work last week. She has no windows on 3 walls. None. And now she's piling sod halfway up the timber like she's burying the thing. And she's plowed a ring of bare dirt 30 feet wide around the cabin. Good land that could be growing wheat." He turned to Orrin Prescott, the quiet Norwegian who had the claim to the north. "Orrin, you understand her better than the rest of us. Is she all right?" Orrin, a man of very few words in any language, said only, "She knows what she is doing." DeWitt Atterbury, Leland's cousin, was less restrained. "Looks like a grave with the headstone still sticking up," he said, and Eben Thatcher laughed. Jessamine Kincaid turned to Maren directly, face to face. "Mrs. Hewitt, a proper American home has windows on every wall, for light, for air, for seeing your children at play in the yard. You build like this, your children will grow up in darkness." Maren listened to all of it. She thanked Jessamine for her concern. She did not explain. Then Reverend Ashford spoke. He spoke last, and he spoke with the measured tone of a man who understood that his words carried more weight than anyone else's in the room. "Mrs. Hewitt, I will not say whether you are right or wrong, but I will say this: in a small community, when one family lives in a manner completely different from every other family, It creates a distance, and distance is not good for anyone, especially not for children. It was not a threat. It was polite. It was reasonable. And it was more dangerous than all of DeWitt's mockery and all of Jessamyn's lecturing combined, because it reframed Maren's construction choices as a moral question. She was no longer the eccentric foreigner who built strangely. She was now the mother whose children lived in darkness, apart from the community behind walls that shut out the light. Maren said, "Thank you for your concern, Reverend." Then she took her children's hands and walked to her wagon and drove home and continued building exactly as she had planned. But the words followed her. In late August, Jessamyn Kincaid found Maren alone at the community well. No audience this time, no church crowd, just two women and a bucket. "Margaret told my daughter Nettie that our house will burn," Jessamyn said. She told Nettie that any house with south-facing windows will burn when the fire comes. My daughter came home crying and did not sleep all night. Maren set her bucket down. "I will speak with Margaret." Jessamyn lowered her voice, and what she said next cut deeper than anything that had been said at the church, because it came not from mockery, but from something that looked very much like pity. "Mrs. Hewitt, I don't hate you, I feel sorry for you. You came here alone, no husband, no family. And you think you know better than everyone around you. I have seen your kind before. People so frightened that they turn their whole life into a fortress. But you are not just locking yourself in. You are locking your children in with you." Maren felt the words land like a slap. Not because Jessamyn was entirely wrong, because there was a small piece of truth in what she said that touched the one fear Maren would not speak aloud. Was she passing her own terror on to her children? Was she building a shelter or a prison? She picked up her bucket. "Thank you, Mrs. Kincaid," and she walked away. On the wagon home, Margaret sat beside her, holding the reins, while Maren stared at the horizon. "Mama, did I say something wrong to Nettie Kincaid?" Maren took a long time to answer. "You said something true." "Then why is everyone angry?" "Because there are things that are true that people are not ready to hear." Margaret thought about this. "So I have to lie." "No, you stay quiet. Being quiet and being right is not lying." Margaret nodded slowly. She was 8 years old, and she was learning something that most people do not learn until they are much older. That knowledge is a kind of loneliness when the people around you do not share it. September came and the wind shifted. The smell of distant smoke grew stronger. The grass cured out to the color of old straw. And one evening, as the light was failing and the south wind carried the first faint taste of ash from fires burning somewhere far away in the Indian Territory, Reverend Ashford rode up to Maren's cabin alone. He sat on the bench outside the north door, the only side of the cabin that had a bench, the only side that had a window, and he spoke quietly. "Mrs. Hewitt, some people in the congregation have spoken to me. They say Margaret has been telling the other children they need to practice closing their shutters, that the fire is coming and any house with windows will burn. I know you believe this, but you are teaching your children that everyone around them is in danger. That is not a good lesson for children." Maren stood in the doorway, her hands still dusted with flour from the bread she had been making. She looked at Ashford and saw that he was not angry. He was worried, genuinely worried, and that was what made his words heavier than anger would have been. "Reverend," she said, "where I come from, children practice closing shutters the same way children here practice beating out fires with wet sacks. They are not frightened. They are prepared." Ashford looked at her. Prepared for what? For something you have not seen but I have seen. He stood up and brushed his trousers. He put his hat back on, and before he left he said, I hope you are wrong, Mrs. Hewitt, because if you are right, it means all the rest of us are wrong. She watched him ride away in the dusk. Then she went inside and closed the door. Margaret and Paul were already asleep, curled together on the straw mattress in the corner. The cabin was dark. One window on the north wall shuttered now against the evening air. 3 solid walls of oak banked with soot holding nothing but shadow. Maren sat down beside the iron stove. The embers were low, giving just enough light to see the outlines of her children's faces. She sat there for a long time in the cabin that everyone called a coffin, and she understood with a clarity that felt like cold water in her chest that she was completely alone in what she believed. The kindest man in the valley thought she was wrong. The most forthright woman in the valley pitied her. Her own daughter was learning to carry a truth that made other children cry. She reached up to the shelf above the stove and took down her notebook. She did not open it. She held it in her lap, the leather soft and warm from the heat of the stove, and she pressed her palm flat against the cover the way she used to press her palm against her grandfather's hand when she was a small girl on the pusta, and the wind was blowing, and the grass was burning somewhere beyond the horizon, and the old man would say without looking down at her, "Listen to the wind, child. It will tell you where the fire is going." She put the notebook back on the shelf. She checked the iron brackets on the shutter one more time. The bar dropped into its cradle with a clean metallic sound that echoed in the small dark room. Then she went to bed. Outside, the south wind blew steady and warm across the cured grass of the Kansas prairie, and it carried on it the smell of something burning a long way off, getting closer. The summer of 1879 was the driest anyone in the Salt Creek Valley could remember. Rain fell only twice between the middle of June and the end of August, and both times it came as brief thunder showers that cracked the sky open for 20 minutes and then sealed it shut again, leaving the dust wet for an hour before the wind dried everything out, as if the rain had never happened at all. By the first week of September, the blue stem and the switchgrass and the side oats grama that covered the open prairie had cured out to a color that was no longer gold, but something closer to the pale gray of old paper. Maren Hewitt stood on the ridge north of her cabin one morning and pulled a handful of blue stem from the ground and bent it between her fingers. It snapped clean, dry as a matchstick. She let the pieces fall and watched them scatter on cracked earth, and she did not need her notebook to know what was coming. The whole prairie was waiting for a spark. She had finished her preparations weeks ago, but she checked them again anyway because preparation without verification was just hope wearing a better name. The root cellar on the north ridge held everything she had grown that summer: potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, dried beans, and 2 barrels of salted pork she had bought from a peddler in August. The food was not in the cabin. It was up the ridge in the earth away from fire. The water barrels, all 6 of them, stood in a row along the north wall of the cabin, beneath the single window filled to the brim from the creek. The cow was in the small barn on the north ridge, and the chickens were in their coop beside it, and the path between the cabin and the barn was clear and beaten flat, and easy to follow even if the smoke was so thick you could not see your own hand. She had built the tin-faced shutter for the north window in late August. A peddler had come through the settlement selling stamped tin meant for roofing, and Maren had bought a sheet and cut it and folded it to fit the shutter, exactly nailing it on with copper tacks that would not rust the iron hinges. When the shutter was closed and barred from the inside, the tin face would throw radiant heat back away from the glass behind it. She had tested it several times during September, timing herself with the small clock on the mantel. Then she had taught Margaret. The first time the girl took 45 seconds. Too long. Maren showed her where to grip, how to swing the heavy panel, how to guide the iron bar into its brackets without fumbling. Margaret tried again. 36 seconds. Again. 32. Again. 28. Good, Maren said. That is good enough. Paul sat on his stool by the window watching his sister practice. He was 5 years old, too small to reach the shutter bar, and he watched with the grave attention of a child who understands that something serious is happening even if he cannot fully understand what. When Margaret finished her last practice run, Paul looked up at Maren. What if I can't close it in time? Maren knelt down, so her eyes were level with his. You will not need to close it. Margaret will close it. Your job is to sit still and listen to me. Paul nodded, solemn as a small soldier. And Maren looked at her son's face and saw her grandfather's face looking back at her, the same dark eyes, the same patient gravity. And she thought, he is 5 years old and he is asking the right question. 5 years old and already more careful than every grown man in this valley. One afternoon in the middle of September, Nella Pemberton walked up the ridge to Maren's cabin to return a reading premiere that Margaret had borrowed from the schoolhouse. Nella was 22 years old, barely a year into her first teaching position, and she had the particular quality of young people who have not yet learned to stop being curious about things that everyone else has already decided they understand. She had light brown hair that she kept pinned in a practical knot, and she carried a notebook everywhere she went. A habit that Maren recognized immediately because it was her own habit and her grandfather's habit before her. Nella stood outside the cabin and looked at it for a long time before she knocked. The sod banking was dark against the pale grass of the fire break. The 3 windowless walls rose above the sod like the walls of a small fortress. The shake roof was heavy and dark. The whole structure sat in the middle of its 30-foot ring of bare earth like something that had been placed there on purpose by someone who had thought very carefully about what purpose meant. Nella knocked on the north door. Maren opened it. Nella handed her the primer and said, "May I ask you something?" "Yes." "What does the sod banking do?" Maren paused. She set the primer on the shelf inside the door and looked at Nella Pemberton, and something shifted behind her eyes, because this was the first time in 14 months that anyone in the Salt Creek Valley had asked her why instead of telling her she was wrong. She stepped outside and walked Nella around the cabin, and she explained, "Sod does not burn. Grass on the surface may catch, but the compressed earth beneath it will not sustain a flame. Stacked against a timber wall, it does 2 things at once. It insulates, keeping the interior cool in summer and warm in winter, which is useful but not the reason Maren built it. The reason Maren built it is that when a grass fire approaches a structure, the fire itself is not the first thing that arrives. What arrives first is radiant heat. Invisible energy radiating outward from the flame front, traveling at the speed of light, raising the temperature of every surface it touches. Dry wood can reach ignition temperature from radiant heat alone without an flame ever touching it. A log wall facing a fast-moving grass fire can begin to smolder and then combust, simply from the heat washing over it from dozens of feet away. But sword-packed 6 feet high against the timber absorbs that radiant energy. The outer surface scorches. The earth behind it stays cool, and the timber behind the earth never reaches ignition temperature. She explained about the windows. Single pane glass, the kind every cabin in the valley used, fails at remarkably low temperatures. 250 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the temperatures generated at the leading edge of a fast-moving grass fire. And when the glass fails, it does not simply crack. It shatters inward, falling in fragments across the floor. And in that instant, the entire protective envelope of the cabin is breached. Embers and burning grass that are swirling through the air outside now have a direct pathway into the interior. Curtains catch, tablecloths catch, rag rugs catch, and the cabin burns from the inside out faster than any human being can respond. A house with 4 windows has 4 points of failure. A house with 1 window shuttered with iron and faced with reflective tin on the wall facing away from the fire wind has functionally 0 points of failure from glass breach. She explained about the fire break. Fire needs fuel. Grass is fuel. Bare earth is not fuel. 30 feet of bare earth between the fire and the cabin forces the flames to cross a gap with nothing to sustain them. They lose height. They lose intensity. Embers still fly carried by the wind, but the main body of the fire starves and drops before it reaches the walls. Nella wrote everything down, every word. Her pencil moved steadily across the pages of her notebook, and she did not interrupt, and she did not argue, and she did not offer suggestions about how proper American homes were built. When Maren finished, Nella closed her notebook and looked at the cabin again. Then she looked at Maren. "Mrs. Hewitt, have you ever been afraid that you're wrong?" Maren was mending Paul's shirt. She did not look up immediately. Then she said, "Every night." Nella was surprised. "Then why did you build like this?" "Because I am less afraid of being wrong than of my children dying." The silence between them lasted a long time. Then Nella said quietly, "At school the children ask me why your house has no windows. I don't know what to tell them. What would you like me to say?" Maren thought, "Tell them there are many ways to build a house. Some ways are built for ordinary days, and some ways are built for the days that are not ordinary." Nella nodded. She picked up her notebook and tucked it under her arm and walked back down the ridge toward the schoolhouse. Maren watched her go. The girl moved quickly, with the unself-conscious stride of someone who had not yet learned to slow down for the sake of appearances. And Maren felt something she had not felt in 14 months of silence and sod and solitary labor. She felt seen. Not agreed with, not validated, just seen. As if someone had finally looked at her work and understood that it was work, not madness. But she checked herself. One person asking the right question did not change the direction of the wind. The fire would still come, and when it came, it would not care who had asked and who had mocked. It would only care what you had built. On the 4th of October, old Hiram Colfax stopped by with a sack of cornmeal he had brought up from the mill at Council Grove. He climbed down from his wagon and stood in Maren's yard. and looked south for a long time without speaking. The sky had a particular color to it that afternoon, a yellowish cast that was not cloud and not dust but something else entirely, something that hung in the atmosphere like a stain. The smell of burning grass was stronger than it had been all summer. Colfax had been freighting on the plains for nearly 20 years. He knew fire weather the way a fisherman knows storm. Weather not from instruments, but from the feeling in his joints and the taste of the air. "It's coming," he said quietly. "Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe a week, but it's coming." Maren nodded. She had felt the same thing since she woke up that morning. Colfax looked at her cabin with its sod-banked walls and its tin-faced shutter and its wide ring of bare earth, and he said, "I think your foreign ideas are going to do better than my American ones if it comes hard." "I hope you're wrong about it coming hard," Maren said. "Me too." He was started to climb back onto his wagon, then stopped. "Mrs. Hewitt, if the fire comes and anyone runs past your place, let them in. Your cabin is the only one in this valley I trust to stand." "The north door will be open," Maren said. Colfax nodded and drove away. That night Maren could not sleep. The south wind was blowing steady and hot, whistling through the ventilation gap under the south eave, and the cabin was warmer than it should have been for early October. She sat beside the stove with the fire burned down to embers and listened to the wind push against her south wall, and she opened her notebook to the last blank page and wrote 2 sentences. "If I am wrong, my children have lived in darkness for nothing for 14 months. If I am right, my children live." She closed the notebook. She placed it on the shelf above the stove. She went to the north window and tested the shutter bar one final time. The iron dropped into its brackets with the same clean sound it always made. Then she went to bed, and she did not sleep, and the wind did not stop. The fire came on the morning of October 9th. It started somewhere south of the Saline River, probably from a careless cooking fire at a freight camp, or possibly from a bolt of dry lightning that had cracked through the ridge of high pressure 2 nights before. By the time the smoke column was visible from the Salt Creek Valley, the head of the fire was already 40 miles wide and traveling north at the speed of a galloping horse, driven by a south wind that had been building since dawn and was now gusting past 35 miles per hour. The settlers saw the smoke at about 10 in the morning. By 11, the column was tall enough to throw a shadow across half the sky. The air smelled like a blacksmith's forge, hot metal and burning grass, and something acrid underneath that caught in the throat and made the eyes water. Maren was in her yard, pumping water into the last of her barrels when she saw it. She straightened up. She wiped her hands on her apron. She called for Margaret and Paul to come inside. Then she walked once around the perimeter of her fire break, and she did not inspect it the way she had inspected it a dozen times before. She walked it quickly, with the efficiency of a woman who already knew every inch of the ground and was only checking for overnight changes. She found 2 thistles that had sprouted near the south wall, and she pulled them up and tossed them beyond the break. She moved her cow and chickens into the barn on the north ridge and barred the door. She climbed up onto the sod banking and checked the roof and chimney one last time. Then she went inside and barred the cabin door behind her. Before she barred it, she stood in the doorway and looked out. A quarter mile to the south, Leland Atterbury was climbing onto his roof with a wet blanket in his hands. His woodpile was stacked against the south wall of his cabin, where it was convenient to the kitchen. His 4 windows, one on each wall, single pane glass set in pine frames, caught the late morning light and glinted like signals. To the west, Jessamine Kincaid was running between her cabin and the well with a bucket in each hand. Her husband Otis was at his forge 100 yards from the house, hammering something that no longer mattered. Maren wanted to shout. She wanted to scream across the distance, leave the house, run to the plowed field, lie down in the dirt, cover yourselves. But she knew with 14 months of certainty that no one would listen. She had tried to tell them with sod and timber and bare earth and iron, and they had called it a coffin. Words would do even less. She turned away from the door. She closed it. She dropped the bar. The wind was a steady roar from the south, now hot and dry, carrying the first faint particles of ash. Maren stationed Margaret at the iron stove, with instructions to keep a small fire going for tea, because the day was going to be long, and they would need to drink. She stationed Paul on his stool by the north window, with instructions to watch the horizon and tell her if anything changed. She herself climbed up onto a chair by the ventilation gap near the south eave and watched the smoke advance. By noon the column had become a wall. The air outside had taken on the dim brown color of a heavy dust storm. Temperature was climbing fast. Maren could feel it through the mesh of the ventilation gap, a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the sun heat that was pushing ahead of something enormous and getting closer by the minute. At 1:15, she heard a sound from the south, distant, sharp, like someone throwing a stone through a pane of glass. Then another, then a scream, a woman's scream, high and thin, cut off by the wind. Margaret looked up from the stove. What was that, Mama? Don't look, keep the fire. At the north window, Paul was narrating what he could see in the calm, precise voice of a 5-year-old who does not fully understand what he is witnessing. There is black smoke from Mr. Atterbury's house, Mama. People are running. Mrs. Atterbury is carrying the baby. Mr. Atterbury is on the ground. I think he fell off the roof. Maren's jaw tightened. Paul, look further. Look at the north ridge. Is the barn all right? Paul turned his head. The barn is still there. Bessie is making noise. Good, keep watching the barn. At 1 o'clock, the fire reached Maren's claim. She saw it through the ventilation gap. The leading edge of the flames crossed her southern boundary in a line that stretched beyond her field of vision in both directions. And the flames at the head of the fire were 10 to 12 feet tall, where the grass was tallest, bending and twisting in the wind, moving with a speed that was not the speed of something burning, but the speed of something running. The grass at the outer edge of her fire break was the last thing to ignite before the flames hit bare earth. She saw the fire climb, reaching, stretching across the gap. Embers flew through the air in their thousands, glowing red against the dark smoke, and some of them came down on the sod banking, and some came down on the bare earth, and a few came down on the shake roof. But the fire hit the 30-foot gap and found nothing to eat. The flames dropped. Within seconds, the 12-foot wall of fire that had been racing across the prairie collapsed to a smoldering line of charred stubble at the edge of the break. The main body of the burn split around her cleared ring and continued north on both sides, roaring past her east and west walls with a sound like a freight train passing through a tunnel. The radiant heat continued. It blasted across the bare earth and slammed into her south wall with an intensity that made the inside of the cabin grow noticeably warmer, even through 10 inches of oak and 6 feet of sod. Maren could feel it on her face from her position at the gap. She climbed down quickly and went to the north window. Paul moved back from the glass. She pulled her son off his stool and set him on the floor beside Margaret. Then she gripped the iron-bound shutter and swung it closed and dropped the bar into its brackets. The tin face sealed the last opening in the cabin. Total darkness. The only light in the room was the small fire burning inside the iron stove, casting a low orange glow across the floorboards and the 3 faces in the room. The wind screamed against the south wall. Embers spattered on the roof overhead like hail, hissing and popping where they landed on the thick green oak shakes. But there was no deeper sound, no roar of ignition, no smell of burning wood from above. Paul crawled across the floor and wrapped his arms around Maren's leg. Margaret sat beside the stove with the fire poker gripped in both hands, her eyes fixed on the small flame inside the iron door, as if it were the only fire in the world she trusted. 8 years old, the girl who could close the shutter in 28 seconds, sitting in the dark while the prairie burned outside and her hands were not shaking. Maren sat down between her children. She did not pray. She counted. She counted the rhythm of the wind. She counted the intervals between the small pops and hisses on the roof. When the intervals grew longer, she would know the fire was passing. The heat inside the cabin was rising. Not dangerously, not yet, but enough that Maren could feel the sweat running down her back and pooling in the creases of her elbows. The south wall radiated warmth like a stone oven that had been fired all day. She placed her palm flat against it once briefly and pulled it away. Warm, not hot. The sod was doing its work. Paul spoke from the floor beside her leg. His voice was small but steady. Mama, the wind sounds angry. The wind is not angry. The wind does not know we are here. That is why we are safe. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is Bessie safe? Bessie is in the barn on the north ridge. The fire is going south to north. The barn is behind the fire now. Paul processed this. Even at 5, even in the dark, even with the sound of a prairie fire roaring past the walls on both sides. His mind worked the way his mother's mind worked, in sequence, in logic, in the order of things that mattered. Margaret had not moved from her position beside the stove. She sat with her back straight and the poker across her knees, and she watched the small fire inside the iron door, the way a sentry watches a perimeter. Once, when a particularly heavy gust of wind struck the south wall and the timbers groaned, she looked up at the ceiling and then looked back at the stove and did not speak. She was counting too. Maren could see her daughter's lips moving silently in the orange light, counting the seconds, counting the intervals. 8 years old and already keeping time against the fire, the way her mother kept time, the way her great-grandfather had kept time on the pusta half a century before. 1:15. The intervals were shortening, more embers. The fire's eastern flank was running along her east fence line now, and the heat from that direction was hitting the east wall almost as hard as the south. But the east wall was solid oak backed by sod, and there was no opening anywhere on it. 1:20. The intervals steadied. 1:25. They began to lengthen. 1:30. A sound Maren had not expected. Not the patter of embers. Something heavier. A crash on the roof, concentrated at the southwest corner, followed by a sound she recognized instantly, the low crackle of wood beginning to burn. Not an ember. A burning branch. A cottonwood limb, carried by the wind from the trees along the creek, had landed on the one spot where the shakes were thinnest at the junction of the roof ridge and the southwest corner. Maren was on her feet before the sound finished. She grabbed a water bucket from the row along the north wall. "Margaret, open the north door, only the north door." Margaret dropped the poker and ran to the door and lifted the bar. Maren pushed through into the smoky air outside, circled to the west side of the cabin, and climbed up the sod banking. The sod was hot under her hands and knees, but it was not burning. It would never burn. She reached the roof line and saw the corner where a 3-foot section of cottonwood branch lay across the shake's charred black with a ring of orange flame spreading outward from it into the green oak. She poured the bucket. The water hit the flame with a hiss that sent up a column of white steam. The fire went out. The branch rolled off the roof and fell into the bare dirt of the fire break. Maren looked at her hands. The skin on her palms was pink and starting to blister from the heat of the sod. She climbed down. She went back inside. Margaret barred the door behind her. "Mama, are you all right?" Margaret was looking at Maren's hands. "I am fine. Make more tea." And that was the moment when the design proved that it was not perfect. No design is perfect. What separates a structure that survives from a structure that does not survive is not perfection. It is whether the builder has left enough margin for the imperfect moment and whether the builder is willing to fill that margin with her own body when the moment comes. Maren sat back down between her children and listened to the fire pass. The intervals between the sounds on the roof grew longer, then longer. Then there were no sounds at all. The roar of the wind began to fade. The heat against the south wall, which had been pressing inward like a living thing, began to ease. At 2 o'clock, the head of the fire was a mile north of her claim, still moving fast, and the air in her yard was beginning to clear. While Maren had sat in darkness, counting the rhythm of embers, the fire had done its work across the valley. Leland Atterbury's south window had failed first. The glass cracked along a jagged line from the upper sash to the lower sill, then shattered inward across the kitchen table. Within seconds, a burning tuft of grass sailed through the opening. The interior caught before Leland could reach the bucket he had left by the door. His west window failed at almost the same instant. His east window followed within 2 minutes. By the time Leland got his family out the north door, 3 of his 4 windows were broken, and his cabin was burning from within. He laid Tabitha and the 3 children flat on the bare earth of his single-plowed furrow and covered them with the wet blanket. They survived. The cabin, the woodpile stacked against the south wall, the barn and 2 horses he could not release in time did not. At the Kincaid place, half a mile west, Jessamine had been hauling water from the well when the south window blew in. She saw the glass fail from across the yard. Otis was at his forge when the fire arrived. He threw himself into the small stream behind the smithy and pressed his face into the mud and held his breath while the flames roared overhead. He survived. Jessamine did not. She had run back inside after the glass failed to retrieve the family Bible from the back room. A burning beam collapsed across the doorway and trapped her. Otis would not find her body until the following morning. DeWitt Atterbury's cabin, 2 miles to the southwest, sat on a slight rise, surrounded by cured weeds that had grown up since spring. The fire reached it at about 1 o'clock. South window first, then west. The family survived in the root cellar. They emerged after dark to nothing. No house, no barn, no chickens, no winter food. Eben Thatcher's cabin sat at the head of a low draw that the fire used as a natural funnel, compressing the wind and accelerating the flames. His south wall was ablaze before he could close the door. His wife escaped through the north window. Eben was overtaken in the doorway when the lintel collapsed above his head. He was the only man to die in the valley that day, but he was not the last to die. 2 children at separate homesteads also died that afternoon from smoke. They inhaled in cabins where the windows had failed and the interiors had filled with toxic air faster than their families could get them out. Maren did not know any of this yet. She told Margaret to keep the children quiet and stay inside, and she opened the north shutter just enough to see out. And the light of the October afternoon flooded into the cabin for the first time in nearly 3 hours. Paul squinted against it. Margaret set down the fire poker she had been holding for 90 minutes. Maren looked out at the valley. The grass was gone. From horizon to horizon, the land was black. Thin smoke still rose from the ground in places where roots smoldered beneath the surface. The Atterbury chimney stood alone to the south, a column of pale stone rising from a heap of black timbers, with grey smoke curling from the wreckage. To the west, where the Kincaid place had been, there were nothing standing at all except the stone base of Otis's forge. To the southwest, the same. Across the entire valley, where there had been 9 cabins that morning, Maren could count 3 structures still standing, including her own. She opened the north door and stepped out into the yard. The sod banking on her south wall was scorched black on its outer face. But when she pressed her hand against it, the earth beneath the char was warm, not hot, and the timber behind the earth was cool to the touch. She walked once around her fire break. At the outer edge, 2 small patches of the cropped grass had caught fire and burned themselves out, leaving circles of white ash no bigger than dinner plates. She kicked dirt over them. She climbed the north ridge. The barn was intact. The cow was alive, trembling, her eyes rolling wide. The chickens were silent in their coop. Maren opened the barn door and let the cow smell her hand, and the animal pressed its broad forehead against Maren's chest and stood there shaking. She came back down to the cabin. She let Margaret and Paul out into the yard for the first time. She pumped fresh water from the well and washed the soot from their faces. Paul looked up at her with those dark, grave eyes. "Is it over, Mama?" "The fire is over. What comes next is different." She looked south. A quarter mile away through the haze of smoke and settling ash, she could see figures moving. Leland Atterbury was walking toward her cabin. He was leading Tabitha by the hand. Tabitha was carrying the youngest child on her hip. The 2 older children walked behind them close together. All 5 of them were black with soot from head to foot, and they were walking slowly, the way people walk when they have nowhere left to go but know that someone somewhere ahead of them might still have a door. Maren dried her hands on her apron. She straightened her back, and she walked out across the burned ground to meet them. The first person to reach her door was the man who had mocked her the loudest, and Maren opened the door. Leland Atterbury had to duck his head to get through the north door. It was a low door set into the only wall of the cabin that had an opening, and it had been built low on purpose, though Leland did not know that yet. He stepped inside and straightened up and stood in the middle of the room, and his eyes moved across everything they found slowly. The way a man's eyes move when he is looking at something he has been wrong about for a very long time and is only now beginning to understand how wrong. The cabin was dark. One window, the shutter was open, letting in the grey light of an October afternoon, filter through smoke. 4 walls, a plank floor swept clean, an iron stove with a kettle still warm on top, a shelf with a clock and a leather notebook and a tin of tea, 2 straw mattresses rolled against the east wall, a table with 4 chairs, a wooden cross on the north wall above the window, the only decoration in the room. No glass on the floor, no char on the walls, no scorch marks on the ceiling, no smell of burning wood. The smell inside Maren Hewitt's cabin was tea and bread, and the faint mineral scent of damp earth from the sod banking outside. Leland turned to face the south wall. 10 inches of solid oak. Not a crack, not a gap, not a single point where the fire that had just destroyed his home half a mile away could have found a way in. He turned to the west wall. The same. The east wall, the same. Then he looked at the north window, the small pane of double-thick glass set deep in the timber and the iron-bound shutter with its face of stamped tin and the iron bar resting in its brackets, exactly where it had been dropped by an 8-year-old girl's hands 3 hours earlier. He did not speak. He walked to the east wall. The wall he had told Maren should have a window in it. The wall he had said no civilized person would leave blank, and he sat down on the floor with his back against it and he wept. It was not loud. There was no sound at all except the slow uneven breathing of a man whose body was doing something his mind had not yet authorized. Tears ran through the soot on his face and left clean tracks on his skin, pale lines through the black, and he did not wipe them away. And he did not look at anyone, and no one in the room looked at him. Tabitha sat down beside him with the baby on her hip and the 2 older children pressed against her legs. She stared at the floor. The children were silent. Maren set 2 cups of tea on the floorboards in front of them. Then she turned and went back to the north door because there were more people coming. They arrived within the hour. DeWitt Atterbury came on a borrowed mule from the Prescott claim, his face grey beneath the ash. The Thatcher widow came in a wagon driven by a neighbor from beyond the fire's eastern edge, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes focused on something that was not in the wagon, and not on the road, and not anywhere in the visible world. Otis Kincaid came alone. He walked slowly, placing each foot with the careful deliberation of a man who is not entirely certain that the ground beneath him is real. He had not yet found Jessamine. He had searched the wreckage of his cabin for an hour before the heat drove him back, and he had walked to Maren's claim because it was the nearest structure still standing and because he could not think of anywhere else to go. Maren took them all in. She cleared the table and laid blankets on the floor and built up the fire in the stove. She brought food up from the root cellar on the north reach in batches, carrying potatoes and turnips and dried beans down the path she had kept clear all summer for exactly this purpose, though she had hoped she would never need to use it for this. By dusk, she had 11 people in her cabin, including her own 2 children. They sat or lay on every available surface, and they ate what she put in front of them, and they drank what she poured, and they spoke very little, because there was nothing any of them knew how to say. Hiram Colfax arrived late that evening. His wagon came around the long way, skirting the eastern edge of the burn, and when he pulled up outside Maren's cabin, he sat on the bench seat for a full minute, before climbing down, just looking at the structure. The sod was black on the south side. The roof was dark with soot, but it was whole, and there were faces in the window. He brought 2 sacks of flour and a side of bacon and a small keg of whiskey, and he set them on Maren's table. He looked around the room at the 11 exhausted faces. He sat down across from Maren, and for a long time he said nothing at all. Then he said, you knew the whole time, and you let them laugh at you. Maren was pouring tea. She did not stop pouring. What was I to say to them? They would not have listened. They had to see. Colfax looked into his cup. They have seen now. Near midnight, when most of the survivors had found places on the floor and fallen into the shallow, fitful sleep of people whose bodies have shut down before their minds, Otis Kincaid was still sitting in the corner of the cabin. He had not eaten. He had not spoken since he arrived. He sat with his back against the south wall, the wall that had no window, the wall that had saved this cabin and failed to save his, and he held his hands open on his knees and stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. Maren went to him. She did not say anything. She sat down beside him on the floor, close enough that he could feel her presence, but not so close that she was intruding on whatever private country his mind had gone to. She placed a cup of tea on the floor beside his hand. Otis looked at the cup. Then he looked at Maren. His eyes were dry. Whatever weeping he had done it alone in the ruins before he walked here, and he was past it now, or perhaps beyond it, in a place where tears no longer applied. She went back for the Bible, he said. His voice was flat and empty, like a bell that has been struck so hard it can no longer ring. I told her not to go back. She went back. He paused for a very long time. The south window, it went first. Maren did not say I know. She did not say I warned you. She did not say I am sorry. She sat beside Otis Kincaid in the dark cabin in the silence, and she let the silence be what it was, which was the only honest thing either of them could offer the other. After a while, Otis picked up the cup and drank the tea, and after a longer while, Maren stood up and went to check the stove because the fire was getting low and there were 11 people who would need warmth before morning. The following day, riders came up from the railroad town to assess the damage and bring relief supplies. A representative of the territorial government arrived from Topeka the day after that. A young man with a leather ledger and a pen that shook slightly as he wrote. He sat at Maren's table, the only table left standing in the valley, and he asked each survivor to state their name and what they had lost. Leland said his name and sat silent for a long time before he could say the rest. Otis gave his name and then said only, everything. The young man wrote it down. He recorded 6 cabins destroyed, 3 more severely damaged, 5 people dead, including 2 children who died during the following week from burns and from the smoke they had breathed in cabins where the glass had failed and the air had turned to poison before their families could get them out. When he finished the ledger, he closed it and looked around the room at the faces and said, I am sorry. Yet no one answered him because there was nothing to answer. The Salt Creek settlement had been a community of 17 homesteads on the morning of October 9th. By the morning of October 10th, only 7 of those homesteads had structures standing on them that could be lived in, and 3 of those 7 were so damaged they would need to be torn down and rebuilt before winter. Maren's cabin sheltered the 11 people she had taken in for nearly 2 weeks. She fed them from her stores. She let them sleep on her floor. She drew water from her well for them. And she answered over and over the same question they all asked. How did she know? She answered when she was asked. She did not lecture. She did not gloat. When Leland asked, she walked him to the south wall and placed his hand against the timber behind the sod and let him feel how cool it was. When the Thatcher widow asked Maren, showed her the iron shutter and the tin face and the bar in its brackets, and the widow ran her fingers over the copper tacks and did not speak for a long time. When Orrin Prescott asked, she handed him the notebook and let him read her wind records for himself page after page. 14 months of data written in a hand that never wavered. Each person who asked received a different answer because each person needed to understand a different part of what had saved them. Maren did not explain the whole design to anyone. She showed them the piece they could see with their own eyes, and she let the cabin do the rest of the explaining. Nella Pemberton came every day during those 2 weeks. She brought bread from the relief supplies, and she helped Maren cook, and she changed bandages on the burned hands and arms of the survivors. She was the youngest person in the room most evenings, and she moved among the injured and the grieving with the steadiness that belied her 22 years, pouring water and adjusting blankets, and speaking quietly to children who could not sleep. And every evening after the work was done, she sat in the corner with her notebook and wrote down what she had heard that day. She interviewed Tabitha Atterbury. She interviewed Otis Kincaid. She interviewed the Thatcher widow. She recorded carefully and exactly the sequence of events at each homestead, and she noted what had failed and in what order, and she compared it in her own private shorthand to what she had seen at Maren's cabin. One evening, she brought the notebook to Maren and offered it to her. I want you to see what I've written. Maren read the pages slowly. Her English was better now than it had been when she arrived. Nella's handwriting was small and precise and full of abbreviations, and it took her a long time. When she finished, she handed the notebook back without comment. Do you want me to write about your cabin for the newspaper? Nella asked. Maren looked at her. Write. But do not write about me. Write about the design. People will copy a design. They will not copy a Hungarian woman. Nella held the notebook against her chest. That is not fair. No, Maren said. But it is true. And true is more useful than fair. By late October, the survivors had been moved to relatives or to temporary lodgings in the railroad town, and Maren's cabin was her own again. The black prairie was beginning to show the first pale green shoots of new grass pushing up through the ash, and the air had lost the smell of smoke and taken on the sharper, cleaner smell of approaching winter. The rebuilding had not yet begun in earnest, but the conversations had. Orrin Prescott spoke to every survivor he could find, and every new arrival who came into the valley to take up the abandoned claims. He told them what he had seen at Maren's cabin and what he believed it meant for the way they should all build going forward. He was not a man who made speeches, but he was a man who was respected, and when he said something once, people tended to remember it. The community meeting took place at the rebuilt Methodist Meeting House on a Sunday in early November. Nearly every remaining settler in the valley was present, along with several newcomers who had ridden in from neighboring townships after hearing about the available land. Reverend Ashford opened the meeting with a prayer for the dead, and then Orrin Prescott stood up and spoke for 10 minutes about what he had observed at Maren's claim and what he proposed the community do about it. DeWitt Atterbury interrupted him before he finished. DeWitt was living with relatives 20 miles east. He had not started rebuilding. He was thin and angry, and he had not yet decided whether he was angry at the fire or at himself or at the woman whose cabin had survived while his had not. "I will not build my house in a foreign style," DeWitt said. "The fire was bad luck, that is all it was. Bad luck and bad timing. 5 years from now, when there has been no fire, I will have spent 5 years living in a dark box for nothing." Leland Atterbury stood up. It was the first time he had spoken in front of the community since the fire, and the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with the fact that everyone present knew what had happened to Leland on October 9th and how he had come to be sitting on the floor of Maren Hewitt's cabin with tears running through the soot on his face. "DeWitt," he said. His voice was hoarse and slow. "I lay face down on a single plowed furrow with a wet blanket over my wife and children. I listened to my house burn behind my back. I am done talking about bad luck." DeWitt sat down. No one else spoke for a moment. Then Reverend Ashford rose. He stood at the front of the room and placed both hands on the rail of the small pulpit, and he looked out at the faces of his congregation. And what he said next was the thing that changed the conversation in the Salt Creek Valley from a debate into a decision. "I owe Mrs. Hewitt an apology," he said. "I went to her cabin in September and told her she was frightening her children. I told her that teaching her daughter to close a shutter in 30 seconds was not a proper lesson for a child. I told her she was creating distance between her family and this community." He paused. "Her daughter closed that shutter in 28 seconds on October 9th. Her daughter kept a fire going in the stove and made tea while the prairie burned. Her daughter did not cry. Her daughter did not panic. My son is 10 years old, and on October 9th, my son did not know which window to run from." He looked around the room. "I called Mrs. Hewitt's knowledge a theory. I called her preparations extreme. I suggested to her face that she was wrong. What do I call her knowledge now?" He paused again, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter. "I call it the thing we all should have listened to 14 months ago." Maren was in the room. She was sitting near the back with Margaret beside her and Paul on her lap. She did not speak. She did not stand. She did not nod or shake her head or acknowledge what Ashford had said in any visible way. She sat still and listened the way she had sat still and listened for 14 months, while her neighbors told her she was wrong, with the same expression on her face, which was not pride and not anger and not vindication, but something closer to patience. The deep structural patience of a woman who had always known that the argument would be settled not by words but by what the fire left standing. In November, a man named Norris Barlow arrived in the valley to claim the Thatcher land. Barlow was about 50 years old, a traveling blacksmith and former Union soldier who had fought at Chickamauga and Chattanooga before drifting west after the war. He came alone, leading a mule and a cart of tools, and he had the economy of movement and the flat assessing gaze of a man who had learned a long time ago not to waste energy on things that did not matter. He did not know about the fire until he reached the valley and found half of it still black. He rode to Maren's cabin, because it was the nearest standing structure to the Thatcher claim, and he needed directions. He sat on his mule in the yard and looked at the cabin for a long time. Then he dismounted and walked around it. He touched the sod banking. He examined the dovetail joints at the corners. He stood at the edge of the fire break and paced it off. 30 feet. He came back to the front and knocked on the north door. Maren opened it. "Who is in this?" he asked. "I did." Barlow studied her. He was not a man who was easily surprised, but there was a brief rearrangement behind his eyes. "I camped at Chickamauga in '63. Federal engineers taught us field fortification. Trenches, earthworks, cleared fields of fire. Same principles. Deny fuel. Block heat. Reduce exposure surface." He looked at the cabin again. "You learned this from the army." "From my grandfather. He kept cattle on the grasslands of Hungary." Barlow nodded slowly. "Your grandfather and the Federal Corps of Engineers thought the same way. Interesting." He stayed for coffee. He asked Maren 3 more questions about the cabin's design, each one specific and technical. And he listened to her answers the way a craftsman listens to another craftsman, which is to say, with attention and without argument. Then he thanked her and rode to the Thatcher claim and began laying out the foundation for his own cabin. He built it according to Maren's design. 3 blind walls, 1 north window, sod banking, fire break. When DeWitt Atterbury encountered Barlow at the general store in the railroad town 2 weeks later, the conversation was brief. "You're building that foreign style too," DeWitt said. Barlow's voice was flat, neither friendly nor hostile. "I am building the style that did not burn. You can call it whatever you want. I have lived in this valley longer than you. Yes, and your house is gone. Hers is not." DeWitt did not reply. Roscoe Gatewood, the German carpenter, returned to the valley that same month. He had heard about the fire from a freighter passing through his township, and he rode the 40 miles back to Salt Creek to see the aftermath for himself. 3 families hired him immediately to build new cabins on the pattern he and Maren had established that spring. The orientation, the blind southwest and east walls, the single north window, the sod banking, the fire break. Not every family adopted every element. Some insisted on a small window on the south wall for the sake of light, and they accepted the risk. Some banked only the south wall because the labor of banking 3 was more than they could manage before winter. Some built their fire breaks at 20 feet instead of 30 because their claims were small and the lost grazing ground mattered. But the core principle, the idea that a cabin should be designed first around the fire wind and only secondarily around the comforts of daily life, took root in the Salt Creek Valley in the autumn of 1879 and did not let go. Before Gatewood began work on the new cabins, he came to Maren's claim to collect the original drawings she had made on packing paper the winter before. He stood in the yard and looked at the structure he had built 5 months earlier. The sod was black on the south face. The roof was stained with soot, but the dovetail joints at the corners were tight and true, and when he placed his hand against the oak at the southwest corner where the radiant heat had been most intense, the wood was cool and smooth under his fingers. "It stood," he said. He was speaking to himself more than to Maren. "You built it to stand," she said. He looked at her. She looked back, and something passed between them that neither of them named, because neither of them was the kind of person who named such things. but it was there in the yard in the quiet, and it did not go away. Roscoe stayed 3 days that first visit. He slept in the barn on the north ridge, and each morning he walked the perimeter of the cabin and examined the joints and the sod banking and the condition of the timber after the fire. He said very little, but he made notes in a small ruled book he carried in his vest, and Maren noticed that his handwriting was precise and square and nothing like hers, but served the same purpose. On the second morning, he asked her if she had considered reinforcing the southwest corner where the cottonwood branch had landed. She told him she had thought about tin plating the roof. He nodded and said nothing else for several hours, and then at supper he said, "Tin would work, but thicker shakes doubled at the corners would be cheaper and nearly as good." It was the longest sentence he had spoken in 3 days, and Maren noticed that he had been thinking about it the entire time. On the third morning, before he left to begin work on the first of the new cabins, he stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at the cabin one more time. Margaret was in the yard feeding the chickens, and Paul was sitting on the bench by the north door reading a primer that Nella had lent him. "Your children are not afraid," Roscoe said. "No," Maren said. "They are not. That is the best thing about this cabin. Not the walls, not the sod. The children are not afraid." Maren looked at him. It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said about her family since she arrived in the Salt Creek Valley, and it had come from a man who had known them for 3 days. The pattern spread beyond the valley over the following years. Hiram Colfax carried a copy of Nella's drawings on his freight routes and described the design to settlers across 3 counties. At a way station in the next county east, he unrolled the plans on a table for 3 families who were preparing to leave for Kansas. One of them asked who had drawn them. "A Hungarian widow in Salt Creek," Colfax said. "She spent 14 months being laughed at. Then the fire came, and she was the only one who could make coffee the next morning." Orrin Prescott wrote a 4-page letter to his brother in Iowa with a diagram of Maren's cabin included. His brother passed the letter to 2 families preparing for Nebraska. They took the diagram with them. Nella Pemberton's article appeared in the Lyon County newspaper in December of 1879 and was reprinted by the Topeka Commonwealth the following month. True to her agreement with Maren, the article mentioned no names. It described only the design, the orientation, the walls, the banking, the fire break, the shutter. Nella wrote one sentence that was quoted more often than any other in the piece. "This knowledge is not new. It is older than the state of Kansas, but it is new to us because we did not ask the people who already knew." By the middle of the 1880s, a recognizable pattern of fire-resistant construction had emerged across portions of central Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. It was called by several names. Some called it the Prescott Cabin, after Orrin, who had championed it most publicly. Some called it the Hungarian Cabin in a vague nod to the immigrant origin that Orrin always insisted on crediting. Some called it the Dark Wall Cabin or the Wayne Cabin or simply the Fire Cabin. The names varied. The design was the same. The proof came again in the dry autumn of 1885 when fire returned to the Salt Creek Valley. The smoke rose in the south, the wind pushed it north, and Leland Atterbury, standing in the yard of his new cabin, 3 blind walls, and a sod-banked north face with a shuttered window, looked at the sky and did not climb onto his roof. He did not pick up a wet blanket. He called his children inside. He closed the shutter. He barred the door, and he put a kettle on the stove for coffee. The fire came. The fire passed. The cabin stood. Leland opened the shutter. He looked out at the black prairie. He poured his coffee and drank it standing at the window, and he did not say anything to anyone because there was nothing that needed to be said. Maren Hewitt lived on her claim for another 26 years. She married late in 1882 when Roscoe Gatewood returned to the valley after his first wife died of pneumonia in the township where he had been working. He came back to Salt Creek to build cabins for a new wave of settlers, and he came to Maren's claim to consult her drawings, and he did not leave. They were married in a small ceremony at the rebuilt Methodist meeting house with Orrin Prescott as a witness and Nella Pemberton as a guest and Margaret holding flowers she had picked from the prairie and Paul standing very straight in a shirt that was too big for him. They lived together in the cabin Maren had designed and Roscoe had built. He maintained it and improved it over the decades. He replaced the shake roof with tin. He added a small covered porch on the north side. He built better furniture, but he never altered the fundamental design. He never added a window. He never opened a wall. He understood what the cabin was, and he respected it. In the winters, when the snow came down, heavy and the wind howled from the north for days at a time, Roscoe built things. He built a rocking chair for Maren from black walnut he had hauled from the creek bottom, who built a bookshelf for Margaret's growing collection of primers and readers, though by then Margaret was old enough to buy her own books from the catalog and no longer needed primers. He built a workbench for Paul, who had begun to show an interest in tools and wood, and who sat beside Roscoe in the barn on winter evenings and learned to plane and mortise with the same patient gravity he had brought to everything since the age of 5. Maren watched her husband work, and she watched her son learn, and she understood that what Roscoe was passing to Paul was not so different from what her grandfather had passed to her. Not the specific knowledge, the habit of care, the belief that the things you build with your hands should be built to last because the world is not gentle, and the things that do not last are the things that let people down when the weather turns. One autumn evening, many years after the fire, the two of them sat on the north porch watching the sun go down behind the ridge. The light was golden and low coming in at an angle that painted the prairie grass in long shadows. The south wall of the cabin was behind them solid and blank, casting its own long shadow eastward. Roscoe said, "Do you ever want a window on the south wall? The light is better on that side." Maren looked south. The prairie stretched to the horizon open and golden and vast. "I see the south side every time I step outside," she said. "I do not need to see it from inside. Inside is for safety. Outside is for beauty." Roscoe nodded. He did not ask again. Margaret grew up and married a railroad surveyor and moved to Topeka, where she raised 4 children in a house with windows on every wall, because Topeka was a city, and cities do not burn the way prairies burn, and Margaret understood the difference. She never forgot the 28 seconds though, when thunderstorms rolled through Topeka in the summers, and the sky turned green and the sirens sounded. Margaret moved her family to the cellar with a swiftness that startled her husband, who had grown up in a town and did not know what weather could do to a house. She never explained why she was fast. She just was. Paul took over the family claim and expanded it through homestead acquisitions. He built a larger version of his mother's cabin for his own family, 6 children who grew up knowing how to close a shutter and read the wind and keep bare ground around a structure when the grass was dry. He never questioned the design. He had sat at the north window when he was 5 years old and watched the valley burn, and he had lived inside the one building that did not, and that was the only education on the subject he ever needed. Paul became a quiet man like his mother, and like her he kept a notebook. His was not about wind patterns. It was about rainfall and soil moisture and planting dates, the practical records of a working farmer. But the habit was the same, and the discipline was the same. And when his own children asked him why he wrote everything down, he told them what his mother had told him when he was 5 years old. Your job is to sit still and listen. They did not always understand what he meant, but they kept notebooks too. Maren died in 1905 at the age of 60. She had been ill through the winter, a cough that would not clear, a cough that reminded Paul of the winter of 1879, when he was 5 and coughing in the dugout, and his mother had almost drawn a window on the east wall to let in the light. She died in the cabin she had designed in the bed Roscoe had built with the north window open to let in the spring air. The last thing she saw was the light coming through that one window. The window she had chosen, the window that faced the safe direction. Roscoe had preceded her by 2 years, taken by a stroke at his workbench, while turning a chair leg on the lathe he had installed in the barn. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery, beside the Methodist meeting house, under granite headstones paid for by Paul and Margaret. Maren's stone was simple, her name, her dates, and at the bottom, a single word in Hungarian that Paul had asked the stone carver to add. The carver was a young man from Emporia who did not speak Hungarian and did not know what the word meant, but he carved it carefully and exactly because Paul had insisted that every letter be right, and because Paul had stood over him while he worked and watched each stroke of the chisel with the same grave attention he had brought to everything since he was 5 years old, and his mother had told him his job was to sit still and listen. The word was maratunk. It means we endured. On the day the headstone was set, Paul and Margaret stood at the grave together. The prairie was green around them, the spring grass coming up thick and strong the way it always did in the years after a burn. The meeting house bell was ringing the noon hour. Paul said, "Do you remember the night of the fire I sat at the north window?" Margaret said, "I remember. I counted 28 seconds. I didn't count. I looked out and I told Mama what I could see. I was 5. I didn't understand what I was seeing." He paused. "Now I understand thee." Margaret looked at the Hungarian word carved in the granite. She would like this word. She lived this word, Paul said. The cabin Maren built is no longer standing. It was replaced in 1934 by a larger frame house built by her grandson, who used the original sod-banked walls as a foundation but tore down the oak timber above them. The foundation is still visible, however, on a low rise near the ruins of the old Methodist meeting house. A small bronze plaque set into the ground beside it identifies the spot. The plaque placed there in 1979 to mark the centennial of the Great Fire reads in part, "Here stood the cabin of Maren Hewitt, immigrant from Hungary whose methods saved her family and many of her neighbors during the Prairie Fire of October 9th, 1879. She built 3 solid walls against the fire wind and 1 window facing safety. The lesson endures." It does endure. in the bones of structures still standing across the Central Plains, in the building codes of California and Oregon and Australia, where windows in fire zones are now required to be tempered or shuttered against radiant heat. In the design manuals that specify defensible space around structures in wildfire country, clearances that are measured in feet and enforced by law, the same clearances that a Hungarian widow measured by pacing off the ground around her cabin with a borrowed plow in the summer of 1879. Modern wildfire science has validated every element of what Maren Hewitt built. Every principle she carried, from the Pusta to the Kansas Prairie, has been confirmed by laboratories and field studies and the accumulated evidence of a century of wildfire disasters. Her grandfather did not have the vocabulary of combustion science, but he had the knowledge, and he passed it to his granddaughter, who carried it across an ocean and applied it stubbornly in a place where no one wanted to hear it, and her answer held when the answer mattered. In a letter to her own daughter written in 1920, Margaret set down the only epitaph her mother would have wanted. She did not describe the fire. She did not explain the sod banking or the fire break or the shutter. She wrote 7 words that contained everything. My mother never explained anything twice. She built once, and what she built answered every question. The settlement listened in the end, not because Maren persuaded them, because the fire persuaded them, and Maren's cabin was still standing when the fire was done and the questions answered themselves in the silence of a dark room where 11 people sat on the floor and drank tea and understood without anyone saying it aloud that the woman they had called foolish for 14 months was the reason they were alive. That is the legacy, not a famous name, not a monument, just a pattern of building that worked and a community that learned and a chain of knowledge that crossed an ocean and took root in new soil and saved lives in a country that its original teachers had never seen and could not have imagined. Maren Hewitt built a cabin with no windows on 3 sides because her grandfather had taught her how. The decision saved her family. The decision saved her neighbors. The decision passed into the ordinary wisdom of a place that had been willing in the end to learn from a woman it had spent more than a year calling wrong. And in the small cemetery beside the meeting house, the Hungarian word on her headstone faces north toward the safe direction, carved deep enough in the granite that 100 years of Kansas weather have not been able to wear it smooth. Maradtunk. We endured.